Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. I am going to do a brief review, and if you can help me when you ask questions, remind me to repeat them, because on the recording it doesn't always pick up the question, and some people can't figure out quite what that question was. They're just hearing some response. But I'll do a brief review of last week, but the two things are kind of separate. And maybe this is a book. I don't know if it's a book or not, but we'll see. There's a bunch of pages written, although I've thrown away a bunch of them too, so we'll see. But I called it because libraries have books, lots of books, and then how to read the Bible and why. Last week was on how, tonight's more on the why, but I'll do a brief kind of review just to catch up some of you. I did talk about this tradition we have every year with the third grade Bibles, which wasn't that long ago.
I still have mine.
And I also mentioned that Paul Ricoeur had this kind of way of encapsulating the way we interpret. He called one the hermeneutics of suspicion, one the hermeneutics of reception, that we are sometimes asking questions and doubting. It's almost like a pessimist-optimist kind of perspective. I feel both of those things when we give out third grade Bibles. I think, oh, this is so wonderful. And then as a skeptic, maybe cynic, I think, and they're never going to read it. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. But this class is a kind of combination of both. I think the how last week says, hey, if you have a hermeneutics of reception, you're open to that, here's a way to interpret the Bible. This will help you. But the hermeneutics of suspicion, if you are maybe at the place where you go, well, who's going to read it? Well, you're here, but I'm going to try and convince you why you should be reading the Bible, which may be a weird thing to say. So I mentioned last week lots of what's called critical methodologies for how to read the Bible. And you can see the list there. Historical, it's where you look at the context or the background, what was going on. Sunday, Carla read from Isaiah 6, and so you ask the question, well, who was this King Uzziah? Was he in the north or the southern kingdoms? And when did he live? And who was Isaiah? That's historical context. Then you look at grammatical. In this case, Isaiah 6 is written in Hebrew. When they describe the angels, the seraphs, that have 6 wings, and with 2 they covered their eyes, and with 2 they covered their feet. It's not feet in the Hebrew, it's genitalia. And then with 2 they flew. Well, if you're reading the Hebrew, you go, now why in the world did they call that feet? I've never heard that euphemism. So you look at languages, New Testament written in Greek. And then form criticism. I'll say more about it in just a second. But this is the notion, and we know it's true, that whatever the stories are, they were told for generations before they were written down. The book of Genesis, for instance, that starts with the creation story, was written roughly not too far off the time of Isaiah, probably in the 6th century BCE, 600 years before the time of Christ. That's when they wrote it down, but these stories have been going on for a long time. So what form did they take, and how did they change over time? And that one's a little tricky to do. Then there's social science, where you're looking at customs and culture, those kinds of things. What does it mean to live in a shame and honor society? We know that the Middle East is totally built on shame and honor. It's why if they lob rockets over, they have to lob rockets back. Even if we shot them all down, we have to, because our honor's at stake. That same dynamic is in biblical text too. And then we look, just briefly, I just mentioned this in the list, feminist, how when I read a commentary written by a feminist scholar, I'm just like, oh my God, I never would have seen that in a million years, because I'm not female. And women read differently. They ask questions like, so how come all of these women in the Gospels, a lot of them don't have names, right? The hemorrhaging woman, the bent woman, the woman with the issue of blood, etc. Post-colonial, it's a lot of complication to it, but one simple way is to say, what does it mean to read through the eyes of the poor? And a friend of mine, in her book she wrote, it makes a difference if you read the Beatitudes in a Starbucks near your house versus on the street corner downtown next to a homeless person. the text is going to sound different. And then last, literary. How do the characters and the plot, how does all of that function? That's a way to interpret. But the one we focused on was rhetorical criticism. So I mentioned that form criticism, those forms that were passed down for generations. Well, you can't really get to those. They were oral. So it's kind of hypothetical and speculative. So we know the biblical authors, products of their culture. They inherited literary forms from the culture. The Assyrian culture, this is how they told stories. The Babylonian culture, the Roman culture, all of these cultures, the Greek, Egyptian culture, Sumerian culture, all of these cultures influenced the way literature happens. Well, these Old and New Testament writers, they were products of their time. They're writing literature. And so you learn from that, and you can study them. And so the little phrase there at the bottom, in addition to what a text says, we can study how it says it. And we don't treat the how as packaging. And then we looked at 7. I use the image of walking around the library. So if you go in the library and you pick up a science fiction book, you walk over 2 rows, you pick out a poetry book, you know you have picked up 2 entirely different books. They might even be about the same thing, so to speak, right? But they're different because it's poetry, it's science fiction. So we walked through the library called Bible. The word Bible literally means the books. And we checked out 7 different ones. These 7, Torah or law, prophets, writings, gospels, acts, epistles, and apocalypse. And we just looked at a text from each one of those, played with it, kind of examined it. That's rhetorical criticism. Tonight, I'm trying to get you to use your library card. That's a metaphor, right? So there's a literary form. I'm trying to get you to use your library card and check out a book from the library called Bible. So the question is, why read the Bible? Now, this is a catch-22. How does one write a book convincing people to read the Bible if they have no interest in reading the Bible? It's not going to happen. It's like me trying to sell you a subscription to, I looked up this, I Googled esoteric magazines. And it came up with one called Esoteric. But I kept going, and I got Garden and Gun. I didn't put that one there. Or Trailer Life. Anybody subscribe to Trailer Life? Is there any way I could convince you to subscribe to Trailer Life? No, probably not. So it's a catch-22. I don't know if I can really write a book on why you should be reading the Bible if people are not already convinced they should be reading the Bible. So it's a weird thing. But as I put here, this isn't a book. You're in the room, so let's give it a try. All right? So we're going to try it. I'm going to start with, and this is a very different presentation tonight. It's kind of the thoughts that I'm having as I think about writing about it, but it's sharing my own journey and hopefully inspiring, maybe. At school, many of you probably, Dick and Jane, these were very close friends of mine in school. And in the first grade, I remember this vividly, there was this little bulletin board about this tall above the blackboard that went all the way around the room. And the teacher had put in construction paper the head of a dachshund, right? And then she had all these circles of construction paper. And when you read a book, you could put the next piece of the body of this wiener dog that was going to go all the way around the room to his tail over here. And I was so determined to get this dog all the way around the room. And Dick and Jane were the way I got there, right? At home, it was my close friend, Dr. Seuss. I had every Dr. Seuss book. I'm still a big fan of Dr. Seuss. Do y'all know the book, The Butter Battle book? You should look up The Butter Battle book. It's brilliant. It's on the nuclear arms race.
It's also banned.
Oh, is it banned? Well, then that's even more the reason to look it up. If it's banned, you should look it up. Okay, then fast forward. In college, when I came to faith, I went to work at a Christian bookstore. Well, first, I went to hang out there. and when I called to ministry, I was hooked on, you got to get books, right? And so I'm going there, and I'm getting books, and eventually they said, hey, we need somebody part-time, and we'll pay you in books. I was like, oh my gosh, I've hit the jackpot. I was living at home. This is, I didn't have to have it. So the picture is of the, I want to say that's part of it. I think it's 54 volumes, if I remember right. It's the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit by C.H. Spurgeon, a British Baptist preacher in the 1900s, early 1900s, late 1800s. And I earned it. I would not want to have it now except to sell it because it's worth thousands. But I had a lot of books, loved books, just, was working in a bookstore, was great. When I went to seminary, did my MDiv, stayed on to do a PhD, and in my PhD days, the library had carols for PhD students. So kind of where the camera is standing is where a carol would have been. And among the stacks, you could go back in there, and all the PhD students hunkered down in these little cubicles. And my best friend Ronnie and I, we had part-time jobs. We drove school buses in the morning and stuff. I drove a limo, but 8 to 3, we lived in the library. That's all we did. We went out into the stacks to get books. We read, we wrote, we went back to it. That's all we did. Loved it. It was the best time of my life. And I told Ronnie at the time, this is the best time we will ever have in our life. Because when you become a teacher, you're going to have to grade papers and be on committees. This is it. All we do is read and write. So it was great. It was fantastic. But I love this story. Raymond Brown is considered the premier scholar on the Gospel of John. He's a premier scholar in a lot of things, but he is the premier scholar in the Gospel of John. And he taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And at one point, Chicago Theological Seminary tried to lure him over. Right? I mean, he's the best, right? So let's get him there. So they flew him in, they wined and dined him. They got through the interview and they said, do you have any questions? He said, just one. Where will I live in the library? And they just laughed and he said, no, I'm serious. I live in the library at Union. He had an apartment in the library. He would walk out into the stacks. And I don't know, I've always loved that story. And I mean, it's a monastic lifestyle, right? He was Roman Catholic. So I don't think I could have convinced Carol to live in the library. But if I could have lived in the library, probably would. Okay, so that's my love of books. All right, so now we're going to talk about the magic of an alphabet. This is going to be a little bit hard to grasp, so hang in there. Okay, in the last 40 years, and that's just a ballpark figure, but roughly, there's been a lot of stuff written about what's going on now. We're transitioning from literate to post-literate. It's not illiterate. It's a time when it's not that people can't read. They would say, why would I when I can listen to it, or when I can just scroll on my phone and watch, cat videos or whatever. So we're not a reading people as much as we were. We're going from literate to post-literate, sometimes called electronic. So a lot of people are writing about that because it's a pretty big transition moment. Walter Ong, lots of books, but in this one, he looked at the first transition, which was from pre-literate to literate, or from oral to literate. And as I put there have only been 2 transitions in human history with regard to literacy. There was a people who were oral, who became literate, and there was a literate group who became post-literate. And we're living in one of those transitions. It's been going on for roughly 30 years or so. Some people date it 1985, which was the year more videos were checked out than books in the United States. But there's lots of ways that people mark it. And there's a lot written about how, oh my gosh, this is the end of the world. And there's a lot written about, no, there's some exciting things. Because some people say that the electronic and the post-literate is actually closer in nature to what the oral was like. It was experiential. So a lot written about that. Okay, so stay with me. But Ong, looking at the first transition, to go from, we'll just say oral cave dwellers, to go from that to literate means somebody came up with an invention called the alphabet. So it's hard to think about it being invented. It just seems like it was always there, and when we were in kindergarten we learned it, or whatever. But it wasn't. So they of course developed the ability to speak, but somebody came along and said, well, what if the sound could be a symbol? So you can, obviously this isn't the example that would be true to them, but let's say the word dog. They had dogs, so we're going to say the word dog. So we invented a little symbol, looks like this, and then one that looks like this, and then one like this. And this one says, this is a symbol that you look at, but it's a sound called duh. And this is and this is ga, and this is dog. And you're like, okay, got it. Well, yeah, of course we've got it, but that was radical. You could see what had previously only been a sound. The human brain was not made to read. So all the evolutionary biologists say there's nothing natural about reading. We invented that, and the brain gets wired to do that. And it changes because of that wiring. It's being rewired now because of this other transition. But for the first time, people could see sounds. So what happens when we read this strategically arranged alphabet, right? I mean, I would like to have written The Grapes of Wrath. I would like to have written The Handmaid's Tale. But all they did was take 26 letters and very strategically arrange them. They're pretty darn good at it. They won awards for doing it, right? But it's an amazing thing. It's pure magic to read. Reading is not natural, but it is magical. So this is where, and I mentioned this book last week briefly, Proust and the Squid. It was New York Times bestseller, but it doesn't seem like it would be. But this is where this comes in, okay? So this is what Marianne Wolfe writes about Proust and the Squid. In this book, I hope to push you gently toward reconsidering things you might long have taken for granted, such as how natural it is for a child to learn to read. It's natural for a child to learn to read, but it's not part of how we were made. It's just become that way in our culture, right? In the 50s, and this is how you get the title of this book. In the 50s, scientists, and I didn't know this, they studied squids because apparently the way atoms fire and transmit neurons, this was similar to what goes on in the anatomy of a squid. They don't use squids anymore, but they did. And so for her, in the book, it's an analogy for what happens in the brain when it learns to read. And it's very anatomical. It's a very complex piece of the book, and it's also in her other book, Reader Come Home. And quite honestly, those chapters I'm like, yeah, that's interesting, but I'm not really going to spend my time there. Like, they're going to tell me about the chemical that's firing and what's going on. Well, if I was a reading scientist, sure, but I'm not. But the other part of it is where it's really good. Proust, that part of the book, is a reference to Marcel Proust's work on reading as what he called a sanctuary, letting readers encounter thousands of realities they might not encounter otherwise. That's what literature's for. At Jewel, where I'm teaching now, every week when I go into class, just across the hall is the English department, and they have this poster up. Why be an English major? And like the number one reason is experiencing worlds you would not experience, right? It's exposure to other worlds. So that's where the Proust part of it comes in, and that's really the side of it that I'm going to kind of talk about. Okay, so any thoughts or questions so far? Comments?
About the alphabet. Mathematicians are doing the same thing, thinking about the abstract creation of numbers in these symbols. And numbers don't exist.
Right.
We have this construct,
right.
And it does all kinds of fantastic things, but there are no numbers.
Yeah, exactly. But we think there are, right? Because we go, well, no, there is. This is one apple, but it's a construct. But it's very hard because we grew up with it and we're taught it. We just say, well, it must have always been there. But It is a construct, yeah.
Mike,
Mm-hmm.
English is not the first alphabet.
No,
I'm
no.
not good with-
Sumerian is considered the.
How many characters are there?
Oh, I have no clue. It's not terribly many. Most of the ancient alphabets are lower than ours,
Yeah, that was
like
what I
22
thought.
or
That's what I
something.
wondered.
But I think Sumerian might even be less than that. I don't know. Can't read it. Didn't have to take Sumerian. Okay, so the magic of reading. Just a couple of quotes here. 3 actually. This is from Proust. There are perhaps no days of our childhood that we lived as fully as the days we think we left behind without living at all. The days we spent with a favorite book. That is a good day, isn't it?
Amen.
How about this one? I love this one. A book is a heart that beats in the chest of another. That's pretty clever. And then Kafka, books are an axe for the frozen sea within us. Okay, so the magic of reading. Kenneth Burke, and I did part of my dissertation on him, he used a religious term to talk about how, in his case, he wasn't literally talking about books. He was really talking about how speech works and drama. But he used the word consubstantiation. Now that's not the kind of word we use very often, so I'll just kind of break it down. So as it turns out, theologians, when talking about communion or Eucharist, Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it, historically there have been these 3 broad understandings of what happens. Now, you might say, what do you mean what happens? You swallow it or you drink it. That's not what they're doing. They're trying to figure out the meaning of what happens theologically. And this has been debated, still debated. And there are people who care deeply about this and will fight over it. Wars have been fought over it. And there are people who say, who cares? It's, But this is where theologians have come down. You might know this one. Transubstantiation is the technical name for the Roman Catholic understanding that the bread and the wine become the body of Christ. And one of those reasonings actually goes back to a very simple reading of the text. This is my body that is broken for you. And they said, what's the meaning of is? It means it is. So, and so this notion that they become that. Symbolic is almost the other end of the spectrum. The bread and wine, sometimes you'll hear the word emblems, or they signify, they stand for, they remind us of the body and the blood. But they don't become, they don't change anything. In between those two, though, is the Lutheran notion that's called consubstantiation. And honestly, if you had to write an essay in class on what is consubstantiation, you would have a lot of sentences that go, well, it's sort of kind of like, because it's mystery. It's not easily nailed down. It's sort of kind of like Christ is somehow mysteriously present with. You know, that con is with, right? Like in Spanish, con. So Christ is mysteriously present with. They don't become, but neither is this just bread and wine or grape juice, right? Christ is present with. So Burke then says, well, we don't become the characters on the page when we read. Of course not. That would be transubstantiation. I'm not Shakespeare, or whoever on the page. But neither are they merely symbols. So he used consubstantiation to say, we're sort of present with the characters and they're sort of present with us. We sort of enter into it so that, and I'll admit it, reading The Grapes of Wrath, I've cried. It's the only novel I've cried, but I cried in a novel. I've cried in a lot of movies, but they operate on us differently. They have music and cinematography, but I cried. Well, how's that possible? I'm not the Jode family. I'm not loading up and going to California. They're just characters. No, they're not just characters. somehow I entered into and somehow they entered into me. That's what Burke says happens when we read. It doesn't always happen, but you see why he's using that term. It's kind of a mystery. So in a way, this is one of the values of reading the Bible. We enter into vicariously. Now, granted, it's easier to enter into the Joad experience, even though I'm not a part of the Dust Bowl, than it is for me to enter into Abraham and Sarah packing up, because we've got this bigger cultural gap that I don't quite get. And we also have sometimes archaic language, the translation, and we're not as familiar with the literature. And then I love this book, by the way. It's fascinating. So let me tell you about the book. She is not a theologian or a biblical scholar. She's trained in classics. And she loves Greek. She translates all the Greek classics. And then she got so in love with the Bible that she decided, well, I'll just go take a bunch of Hebrew. So she went to seminary just to take Hebrew, didn't take anything else. And she writes this book about the beauty of the language and how it's put together. And this is a line pretty much near the end of the preface. I think it was the preface. So here I am now, trying to make the book, the Bible, less a thing of paper and glue and ink and petrochemicals and more a living thing. And that's what she does. That's what she sets out to do. So that's what I'm kind of doing. My first read of the Bible was on my great aunt's lap. I told my granddaughter about this last night because her name's Emma and my great aunt's name was Emma. And my great aunt took care of me because my parents were working. So as an infant, as a toddler, until I went to like preschool, this was my experience. She was old school Nazarene. She had hair way down, but she always had it up in a bun. And she would feed me pumpkin pie. She put buttermilk in my baby bottle. I grew up drinking buttermilk. I still love buttermilk. And she read the Bible to me. It was this massive book, right? It weighed more than I did. I couldn't even lift it. And I'd sit on her lap, and she'd open that Bible. And of course, it had a picture every once in a while, but mostly she was just reading me these stories. And I remember that. Now, it took a long time for it to take, because I went off on my own. When I came to faith in college, the young lady that led me to that faith, she gave me a Bible. I still have it. But man, I could not make heads or tails of it. Now, I didn't have a librarian to help me. And when they told me, like in church, they'd say, well, we're looking at the book of James. I go, well, what happened to the book of the Bible? Why aren't we reading the book of the Bible? I didn't know there were books inside the Bible. And I thought, well, that's weird to call them books because the Bible is a book. So I was very naive. They used words like Old Testament, New Testament. I knew what old and new meant. I didn't know what a testament was. I had no clue what a testament was. It took a long time for me to find out, well, that's just another word for covenant, and this was the first covenant given. This was a so-called second new covenant. So I really was lost when reading the Bible, but I kept doing it. I just kept doing it. Not sure exactly why. I wish I could remember all of my mindset at the time. Maybe it was because all these other young people were reading it, and I felt like I'm way, way, way behind. Like somehow they've signed me up for trigonometry, but I'm in the second grade or something, like probably ought to try and catch up here. And then when I went to seminary, in PhD, first book they assigned us was How to Read a Book. That is one of the worst books ever written, in my opinion. And most everybody who read it and who has read it has agreed with me. It's a classic, but it is so deadly dull. I don't know why you'd ever want to read a book after reading a book called How to Read a Book. It's horrible, but maybe I would feel differently now. I don't know. Okay, so reading the Bible is not deadly dull. It's not. But you have to know where to look. You have to know how to make sense of its books, and we're going into the library, right? So can somebody point me to where is the science fiction? Where is the poetry? Where is it? Well, the library called Bible is arranged. It's arranged, and it's very strategic how they've done it. So I mentioned last week the Tanakh, which is the Jewish word that's used for the Old Testament that we call Old Testament, sometimes called the Hebrew Bible, but a Jewish Bible is called a Tanakh. And the way it's arranged, and those letters, T-N-K, stand for Torah, Navim, which is Hebrew for prophets, and then Ketavim, which is Hebrew for the writings. So that's why it's called the Tanakh. And so, you know, the law is the first 5 books. The prophets would be like Isaiah and like Hosea and Jeremiah, etc. And then the writings. So the Psalms are in that, but also stuff like Kings and Chronicles and Ruth and all these kinds of things. So that comes last. Now, they have the same books we do. It's a little bit more technical than that, but we'll just say they have the same books we do. But we've arranged ours differently. We put the first 5 books, we call it Law, Torah, whatever you want to call it. Then we put the writings. And then we put the prophets. So if you're looking in a Christian Bible, the last book of the Old Testament is going to be Malachi. It's the prophets. It's the end of the prophets. Why do we arrange it differently? Well, we're making a theological statement there. Christians are saying there is still one to come, and these prophets have prophesied about the one who is still to come. And then we're going to turn the page, which is blank in our Bible, and then we're going to be in Matthew. And on that blank page is going to be 400 years. Okay, but here's the point. The Christian arrangement says they're prophesying about, oh, turn the page, there he is, Jesus. The Jews are saying the prophets come to correct the kings, etc., but the writings end with King Cyrus saying to the exiled Jews, you can return to the land. And so their Bible ends with returning to the land. And of course, that Zionist movement has been going on roughly ever since, I mean, give or take. But that's a different arrangement. So it's the same books arranged differently. Now, you're not going to read the Tanakh regularly. You're going to read the Christian Old Testament. But it's just something to keep in mind for how this library is arranged. Okay. In the New Testament, pretty much know this, right? Gospels come first, even if, and this is where it gets confusing, the epistles were written first. Why didn't they put the epistles first? Well, it's real easy, right? It's because we're going to start with the story of Jesus, and the church's letters are going to come later. But this is where form criticism comes in. If the letters were written first, roughly in the mid-50s, the earliest ones, and Jesus lived in the 30s, you know they had 20 years of telling those stories. It's just they weren't written first. So we put in what wasn't written first, but it made the most sense because it tells the story of Jesus. Makes sense. I'll go for that. Those 4 are arranged beginning with what's called the synoptics. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptics because they see with similar eyes. They tell similar versions of the story. Not identical, but similar. And then John, and he's sometimes called the Maverick, he comes along and he goes, well, I'm not going to tell it the way they did it all. And he tells it in a totally different way. Totally different. Okay, but Mark was written first. And we have Matthew first. Well, that one, it's a little more complicated than this. But one of the reasons Matthew is first, and most of the church fathers knew that Mark was written first. Some thought Matthew was. Most knew it was Mark. But they couldn't resist putting Matthew first because in English, the first words of Matthew are an account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And then, you know, it's a genealogy, so, a genealogy. But account, genealogy are the first 2 words in Greek. In Greek, they are literally book, Genesis. So the first 2 words in Greek in Matthew are book, Genesis. So they thought, well, heck, if the Old Testament starts with the book of Genesis, New Testament ought to start with the book of Genesis. So that's why it happens. But chronologically, Mark's written, Matthew and Luke roughly come after that, and then John after that. Okay, jump in if you have questions or comments. I don't want to lose you, but I do want to move us along. Okay, so then the Gospel of Luke and Acts, which get separated, unfortunately. John's in between them, right? They make up the largest chunk of the New Testament. A fourth of the New Testament is written by the person we call Luke. The epistles of Paul, those are arranged from big to little. There's nothing very sophisticated about it. It's not chronological, it's not theological. Romans is bigger than 1 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians is bigger than 2 Corinthians. And then the Apocalypse, Revelation, whatever you want to call it, comes last, in part because of its end-time focus, but also because it barely made it into the canon. Lots of folks thought, I'm not so sure about this one. Lots of folks have thought that ever since. And quite honestly, well, I'll show you in just a second. Okay, so Jews, this is really interesting. Jews think of those three parts as a hierarchy. They really do. The law is clearly, the first 5 books of Moses, as they call it, that is way above the prophets. And the prophets are way above the writings. They have no qualms saying that. I know a lot of Christians who feel that way about things, but will never say it about the Bible. But Jews have no problems sort of ranking that. New Testament scholars do feel that way. I'll show you the language I use. They feel that way about Gospels, for instance, versus Deutero-Pauline epistles. Those are the ones that we're not really convinced Paul wrote. So if you ask a New Testament scholar, how do you feel about Luke and 2 Peter? They'd be like, are you kidding? There's no comparison. But a lot of people were raised in a tradition where you would say every book has the same value. Theologians, scholars would say, no, there's a lot more calories here. In fact, some of the books near the end of the Bible are near the end of the Bible because they're perceived to have barely gotten in or to be less important. So Christians have arranged their Bibles similar to the way Jews have thought, but we haven't always been taught that. So I do think that one tip for reading is to go to the heftier, more central books that have been valued more highly. You might feel differently about that. I do like this little thing that Levine and McKnight refer to the Bible as the principal building block. And they have all these words, phrases that we got from the Bible that have made it into normal everyday speech and literature. Sour grapes, land of milk and honey, etc. Drop in the bucket, handwriting on the wall, all kinds of ones. And of course, then I just put, it helps us to understand Steinbeck's East of Eden, Faulkner's Absalom. So it's there. It's been something that's influenced us as a culture, literature in particular. If this book comes about, one of the ways I thought about organizing it was with a long list of because statements. They might be chapter headings, I don't know. Because Washington and Jefferson had slaves, that's a good reason to read the Bible, because we need to rethink slavery in the Bible and in our history. Because they killed Matthew Shepard. What does it mean to read the Bible with any sensitivity to LGBTQ? Because Galileo was right, and you think about the anti-science kind of readings of the Bible. So I've just been kind of playing with it. I've got a list, very long list, that start with because statements. So anyway, I don't know where it's going to take me, but I am going to read you. I think I got time. This is maybe how the book begins, okay? So don't expect to see it in print. I called it a guidebook to the good book, this little intro. Okay. Do you remember the first time you looked through the pages of a National Geographic? Maybe it was for a book report on modern life in Iceland. Maybe it was the summer you stayed with your grandparents for 2 whole weeks, and one bored afternoon you found the stacks of the magazines on their bookshelves. This latter scenario is the voice of experience at my grandparents' home in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan when I was in the 8th grade. Something marvelous happened within those luscious, thick pages. 3 things, to be exact. 1, the photography was stunning, bursting with colors that made you feel like you were there. The pictures could take your breath away. 2, the places portrayed were wild beyond imagination. Volcanoes in Hawaii, rivers in South America. And 3, an amazing array of people populated the pages. They were exotic, to say the least. Mongolian hunters on horseback, Swahili tribes dancing around a fire, Alaskan fishermen battling the elements. Mark it down, world travel, even in the pages of a magazine, can be transformative, opening us up to new vistas, new peoples, new perspectives. Nowadays, it might happen more on the internet, Google Images and the like. I'm just not convinced it's the same. Believe it or not, reading the Bible is like reading National Geographic, minus the photographs, of course. But still the words on the page paint pictures for sure, in terms of places, Jerusalem and Jericho, Egypt and Ephesus, everything from bedraggled Bethlehem where Jesus was born to metropolitan Rome. To quote Dr. Seuss, oh, the places you will go. In terms of people, a Pharaoh from Egypt early in the story and Roman emperors near the end. But in between, many more peasants than paupers, or paupers and peasants, including a reluctant hero named Moses in the first half of the Bible and one itinerant rabbi named Jesus in the latter part. As for Jesus' story, it unfolds mostly in the 4 Gospels that open the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Among those 4, only the one called Luke felt inspired to write a second volume, a sequel called Acts. Think Actions, if it helps. The book of Actions. If the Gospel of Luke recorded the actions of Jesus, Acts continued with the actions of his followers and the budding movement that would eventually be called Christianity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Shortly after Jesus' ministry, and long before Christianity featured stained glass cathedrals and pipe organs, Acts told some amazing stories of exotic places as well as exotic peoples. Some scholars have even referred to Acts as a kind of ancient version of National Geographic. Here's one story that happens about a third of the way into the overall plot of Acts, and I love it because, among other things, it's a story in the Bible about reading the Bible. So before we plunge in, and we're going to look at it, a word of context. I find this helpful because if I were to read to you a passage a third of the way into Tolstoy's War and Peace, a reminder of where we are in the story would be the considerate thing to share. So in this case, 2 bits of information seem necessary. There's a guy named Philip who appears earlier in Acts as someone chosen to wait tables. And while we all appreciate the wait staff who serve us in restaurants these days, this was a lowly position. In other words, Philip is not a major character in the book of Acts. The second thing to bear in mind concerns the other character, a guy from Ethiopia, of all places. So we're going to look at this text. All right, this is from Acts 8. An angel of the Lord said to Philip. So remember, I just said Philip was like chapters ago, he's a waiter on tables. He just, all of a sudden, he just shows up. An angel of the Lord said to Philip, get up and go towards the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road. So he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He'd come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home. Seated in his chariot, he was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go over to his chariot and join it. So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, do you understand what you are reading? He replied, this is great. How can I unless someone guides me? See, that's the need for the librarian, right there. It's right there. And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now, the passage of the scripture that he was reading was this. Like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. I can see why he said, unless somebody helps me with this, I'm not going to get it. So the eunuch asked Philip, about whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else? Then Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here's water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. Okay, thoughts about that passage? Yes.
Well, that kind of thing happens today, not necessarily with the chariot, but, you feel like, I think I need to call so-and-so.
Yep. Yep.
Call him. Oh, I'm so glad you called. Like, this is what's going on in my life.
Yep, it still does. It's true. We don't always act on it. Yep.
I'm thinking of just as literature now, the literary device of 5, 10, however many pages before we introduce Philip. Well, in drama and theater and literature, you introduce an item, you got to do something with it.
Yes.
In a play, they say if you show a gun in the first act, you got to
Yeah.
use it in the third act.
Right.
And so I think that from a literature standpoint, they planted this, whether it was intentional or not.
Yeah.
And now here comes Philip. Now, where did he come from?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the literary critics are really quick to point this out. So Philip gets introduced, chapter 6, and he disappears. And then he comes up here. But the main characters, you would have to say, are Peter early on and Paul, and then they carry the weight. But they actually sort of fade away. They're the apostles, the big shots, but they end up debating whether or not Gentiles can get in. But people like Philip, the wait staff, he's out doing the work. And so theologians have sort of pointed out, the so-called major characters kind of don't come off looking as good as the minor characters do in this case. Yeah, I mean, I love this story on many, many levels, but one of them is the notion that in the Bible there's a story about reading the Bible. And that little phrase, well, how am I supposed to understand it? How am I supposed to make sense of this thing unless someone guides me? And this is in the Bible, this is said, and so maybe we should take that to heart. Okay, so I already said this. We need librarians, right? So here's a librarian. His name is Richard Purvo. Has a book called Prophet with Delight. And you can see the subtitle there, The Literary Genre of the Acts of the Apostles. So this is the kind of guy that's going to point out what I just pointed out. But his book's called Prophet with Delight. So what he means by that is, it's a Bible story. So Pat's observation is a very good one. We're probably supposed to go, you think there's anything here for me to learn? Well, yeah, like listen to when you're prompted by God to approach somebody, right? Or to ask a question, or to... Well, that's the spiritual lesson. That's the profitable lesson. But he calls it prophet with delight because an axe, remember I told you last week, there were a bunch of acts written. We got one in the Bible. An acts is a delightful genre. It's the literature. It's going to be usually almost an escapade. This one, it's not as action-packed as the one we looked at last week. Last week in Acts, we looked at a storm at sea, swashbuckler. This one's not a swashbuckler, but it's action-packed. And it's exotic. I mean, you can't get any more exotic than a man from Ethiopia. And he's not just a person of color, as we'll see, he's also a eunuch. Okay, so in terms of geography, remember Luke writes 2 volumes. In the first one, everything's leading up to Jerusalem. Jesus even goes on a journey there that takes 10 chapters. Everything's leading up to Jerusalem. In the book of Acts, everything's going to lead away from Jerusalem. They're going to be told to wait for the Spirit, and you're going to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, it's the property in which Jerusalem is found, but also the Samaria, uttermost parts of the earth, which in this case would be Spain, Rome, that kind of thing. So everything's going to lead away. The man that Philip encounters is reading. We're supposed to catch that. That's extremely unusual. 2% maybe could do that. So he's an educated person. He's not, just some servant driving a chariot or riding in a chariot. I mean, he's actually got a driver, as it turns out. He serves in the court of a queen, so he's got some access to power, so to speak. I personally think he'd be an interesting conversation partner over dinner, right? Could tell you some stories. But the one thing that stands out the most is his identity as a eunuch. Someone has castrated this man so that he can be trusted in the queen's presence. Well, that's probably not something he would choose. He'd been to Jerusalem to worship, which of course wouldn't technically really be possible because Gentiles and especially eunuchs are not going to be allowed inside. They would be in this outer court. It's not to say that he can't worship there, but he's not going to have access the way the Jews would, going into the inner court. The passage he's reading then becomes even more poignant. It's about a lamb before its shearer. So when he says, is this about him or could it be about someone else? He's probably asking, is it possible this story has more meaning that maybe applies to him? He certainly knew about shearing. And even more, it says justice is denied him, that kind of thing. And then he asks if the reading from Isaiah is about himself or another, as I mentioned just a minute ago. And then he wants to be baptized. It's a kind of weird narrative in that regard. There's no conversation about it. He just wants to be baptized. And it is a weird phrasing. We wouldn't use this ever. Like, nobody would ever come to a clergy here and say, what's to prevent me from being baptized? They would say, what do I need to do to be baptized? How do I sign up or whatever? And we would talk about that. But nobody phrases it, what prevents me? But of course, why would Luke put that in his mouth to say it that way? Because there's so many things that are preventing him. The things that are preventing him from access in the temple are going to now prevent him, right? In theory, it would seem like, well, there's a lot to prevent you. You're a eunuch, you're castrated, you're Ethiopian, you're not Jew, you're from another part of the world. So it's an interesting way to phrase it. And then what happens next? He says, what's to prevent me? And they go in the water. There's no response on the part of Philip. Yeah.
I think that it's so interesting that the eunuch can represent not just those who are castrated and quote unquote safe, but they represent kind of in your mind a whole class of other people. And so when I read that word eunuch and think about that, and Philip, the kind of lay deacon kind of guy that's hanging out, I think about all the things that we say prevent people from being good Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And that rooted in the Bible is this idea that even the most different, most reduced,
Yeah.
have absolutely, and it leads me to LGBTQIA stuff.
Sure. Sure.
All kinds of things. And
Yeah.
I think it's just such a great reminder that so much we impose on Christianity is not present in us.
Yeah, that, for those who are listening to this afterwards on YouTube, Vicki was making the comment about the eunuch can represent so many other groups who are separated. And it's the kind of groups who get a word assigned to them. Gay, eunuch, whatever word, and not a name. He has no name. Philip has a name. He's a waiter, but he's got a name. Eunuch. You know.
The other never had a name.
Right, right. Yeah. Mhm.
Who in that time period could perform a baptism? Was there any hierarchy of who could do that?
No, baptism was kind of, well, here's where it gets complicated. You're asking the question about the early 30s in history. Luke's writing in the 80s. 50 years plus have passed. So when Luke tells a baptism story, this thing that we now call Christianity and church has evolved and developed, and they have a rite called baptism by which people enter into it. In that moment, that didn't exist. I mean, there was baptism, but baptism is a carryover from Judaism. There's baptism in Judaism, but they call it a mikveh bath. So when you come in contact with a woman on her period, you've become unclean. She's unclean. When her period is over, she's going to go to the mikveh bath. It's a ritual cleansing. It's not like somehow you're now different, but it's ritual. So that tradition carries over into Christianity, and John the Baptizer, he's doing that. Jesus goes down and gets baptized. So, but Luke, you have to think about it written in the 80s more so than think about the 30s. So Luke's telling this 50 years into Christianity. He's telling that story, and he has, here's one. There was this eunuch, and he wanted to be baptized. And everybody there, they're in the church, they're baptized. They're thinking about people who are coming into the faith. Are they going to get baptized? So it's, yeah. But in Jesus' time, or in Philip's time, not the literary, but the time, that was really still evolving as a rite or a sacrament, whatever you want to call it. So, but we can't miss something, although we would. We would miss this. Philip doesn't answer the question, commands the chariot stop, they go down, eunuch's baptized. We might say, ends happily ever after. Well, not exactly. Okay. Some manuscripts, there's a textual variant. What prevents me from being baptized? If you believe with all your heart, you may. And he replied, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Now, when I say it's a textual variant, there were lots of manuscripts. They didn't have Xerox machines, but they had copyists. So if you had a copy of Acts, you could make a copy, and somebody else could make a copy. Well, when people started making copies, some of them wanted to kind of clean up the stories a little bit here and there, like the person who wanted genitalia to be, they covered their feet. So they make these textual variants. And this textual variant is, well, nothing's going to prevent you, but you're going to need to confess faith in Jesus as the Son of God, and when he does, then he can live happily ever after. So a copyist inserted that. And we know that because there's these critical methodologies for figuring out manuscripts as more reliable and less reliable. It's not an exact science, but it's pretty close. And we know this is an addition, a late addition. So it's an interesting example, though, of, this library is pretty complicated. We really could use a librarian's help here, because your Bible doesn't have a verse 37. It goes from 36 to 38, and there'll be a little note that says verse 37 in some manuscripts, etc. So the story about reading the Bible that's in the Bible, all are welcome in God's family. And of course, fear of the stranger, it's xenophobia, it's a problem. Okay, so takeaways. For me, yes, Rob.
You think if we had a major archaeological find and we found manuscripts that we will verify were written contemporaneous to the gospel, do you think it would change the Bible?
It would change it in places, but not in radical ways.
Or do you think people would allow it to change?
Well, you know what? They'd be interested to know that the one they already have has many, many versions. Our good friend David May that was with us in Israel, when he would go to Sunday school, he's not always in Sunday school, but as just sitting in Sunday school, someone would be talking about something, and they'd say, oh, David, tell us what the Greek says there. And these guys Greek New Testament, so he flips it up and he goes, which one? And they go, what do you mean, which one? He says, there's a bunch of manuscripts. So if you could convince the people that they already have a bunch of versions, that we've stitched together this one that we call Luke or whatever, but my hunch would be, now there'd be some that we would say, we're going to reject them because there was a bunch of them that we did. But even if we said, boy, that's just spot on, it'd just be little bits and pieces. But I don't know. It's an interesting question to know. I don't know that we're going to find any, but then again, Shepherd Boy found a bunch of.
What about the books that were submitted to the library, but the librarian didn't care to put them on the shelf?
Yeah. So the ones that didn't make it?
Yeah.
Well, there's some debate. There have been people, for instance, who said Thomas' gospel should have got in and John shouldn't have. There are people who say, oh, no, John's fine, but Thomas should have been included.
Is there any benefit in reading the Apocrypha?
Yeah, there is. There is. I mean, it just gives you a flavor for the times and the variety of literature that was in existence there. Some of them you'll read and you'll go, well, I can see why that didn't get in. It just doesn't pass the smell test. You know, it's got Jesus doing weird stuff, like it's not even in character. I've mentioned before those infancy gospels where he's, cursing his little friends and they die. I mean, you can see why that didn't get in. But there are a lot of fragments, and there's some value in reading it. There's a book called The Other Bible. You can just get it on paperback on Amazon. It's just called The Other Bible, and it's got bunches of those, and you can read them and and it's got a good introduction to them, and you kind of go, huh, that's interesting. But I don't know if it's, yeah. I have 3 takeaways for me. The library's overwhelming. It's still overwhelming, always will be. So start somewhere that appeals. Read the parts with the most calories. So that's just the image I always use. And then we're in desperate need of help from reference librarians. And thank God, there's still people going into PhD programs. They're not going to make any money. And they probably won't get a job because these schools are all broke. But they're going into it. And they spend their days just reading and writing. It's the Walter Brueggemanns and the N.T. Wrights and the Fred Craddocks of the world. And that's all they do. And some of it is pretty esoteric. But they're librarians and they're helping us. So I don't know what your takeaways are, final comments.
Are you writing a book about reading the Bible? Did I hear that briefly?
I'm thinking about it. I've been playing with it for years, but I don't know if it's going to happen or not.
Okay, have you got more in the introduction?
Yeah, I've got quite a bit, but I'm just not totally. The real problem is I'm stuck on what genre the book should be in, which is ironic because I'm talking about genres. There's a part of me that thinks it's just a book. It's a nonfiction book. There's a part of me that thinks it needs to be a fiction. It needs to be in the form of a story with characters like a novel. I wrote one book that way before, a preaching book that's written in the form of a novel. And then there's a part of me that thinks it ought to be a screenplay, which I have no experience with, but I've been to the Iowa Writers Summer Workshop before, and I could take a class on it, and but I don't know. The way I write is when the book idea finally just reaches clarity and I'm ready to go, but it just hasn't happened yet. And I'm still working, and I wrote the last one on a sabbatical, and it's hard to write unless you're on sabbatical. So we'll see.
Back in the day, when people my age or even older than that, within denominations, you would have literature supporting a Sunday school class, and it would always be scripturally based. And there can be a lot of criticism about that, but within denominations, it's not. And I think I'm more than willing to grant different denominations their freedom to read and interpret. But what I'm trying to say is, the benefit of that is it's a way to get started reading the Bible, and then the structure of what to read is coming from the Sunday school materials. And I think there's great value in that. And again, we can argue about one denomination or another, but regardless, they are trying to teach and instruct how to read the Bible.
Yeah, this has happened in the last 20 years. And I watched it happen because I was visiting all these different churches preaching. It used to be Sunday schools where we're doing the book of Philippians, we're doing the book of Genesis, and they had the literature, and it was their denominations or whatever. But at some point, it started to happen, and you can't quite date it, but it rolled out, is that we went to, here's a video series put together by whoever, and here's a book written by Anne Lamott or whatever. And we went away from that because how many times are we going to go through Philippians? Everybody was raised in the church and they'd studied it 100 times. They were like, can't we do something more interesting? We've done this before. But what happened is as that rolled out, and this is really that literate to post-literate thing, we now have generations that never did Philippians. And so they only did the video series and they only read the Anne Lamott book. And those books and videos are built on the people who studied Philippians 10 times. So we're kind of at a place, and this is true in seminary. When I first started teaching seminary, everybody coming in had a Sunday school education. Now, it needed a lot of fixing, but they had a Sunday school education. By the end, there were people coming in who did not know Bible at all. Well, it's very hard to teach them critical reading of the text when they've never even read the text. And so, yeah, we've gotten to a place where, and it probably coincides with what Postman and others were writing about. We went away from reading. So reading the Bible's, this is my hermeneutics of suspicion.
Well, it's interesting that they would go into that without knowing what it was all about.
Well, they kind of know the trappings of it and the big plot of it, but they've never studied it. I mean, in my day, everybody had studied it. Now, we hadn't studied it well. Like, if you went to Sunday school, you were taught Pharisees were hypocrites. They were just hypocrites. And then you get to seminary and you go, well, that's not true. Let me show you who they really were. And you unpack that. And you deconstruct it and build a new framework. But if you have somebody coming in now who's never even read that, it's very, very hard. And seminaries have pared down the curriculum too. It's not as expansive. I had a 96-hour master's. And now it's like some of them are 48 hours, 70 hours. Well, you're not going to get a whole lot of Bible doing that. Yes?
Yes, I think while you are deciding whether or not you're going to write this book and what it's going to be like, that you should, in the meantime, work on a education program for the third graders who get their Bibles. Way more good.
I don't know if I'm qualified to communicate with third graders. I guess I could pick my granddaughter's mind. Yes?
Why would they go to seminary if they've never read the Bible?
They feel a call and they feel a need to help people. Yeah, I don't know. Well, thanks so much for being here. Hope it was helpful in some way or another. So.